The presentation that I've got written out here, why bats do what they do, is very, very broad. And that's because there's a lot that I could have talked about for bats. So before I kind of dive into where we're heading for tonight, just as the introduction, oops, now it doesn't want to advance, of course, that always happens. We start early. Okay, there we go. Just to give you a little bit of information about myself, thank you for reading that bio about me. And if you do want to know more about the bat conservation program for Western Canada, it's one that I direct for BC and Alberta largely. We have a lot of projects that are kind of ongoing. Some of the major current ones I was just going to list here for you to mostly just know what we're doing. I won't actually be going into that today because I've kind of been asked to talk about something that might be interesting for you to understand bats in a whole new way. And so just to very briefly tell you that we do have what we're calling a bat-friendly forestry project that's going on right now, looking at policy and practice, specifically then in British Columbia, filling knowledge gaps, doing some radio tracking of bats, trying to figure out what types of trees they use. It's very interesting what we're finding because bats are using trees in summer and winter. And mitigating for tree loss. So we are doing things like how can you create wildlife trees for bats, and what should those look like, and how do they get used? And we've also been creating what we kind of deemed as fake bark, which literally is fake bark in areas where we know that there are some bats, some of the species that are old growth dependent, for example, still finding a small place to live, whether they're having young. We don't really fully understand that yet, but just small remnant patches of old growth where one of the species in particular, northern myotis, is sort of just barely clinging in some of the areas of its southern range in BC. So that project is kind of ongoing right now, and we're waiting to see where it goes in terms of funding. One that we're sort of wrapping up right now is winter ecology. So we've been looking at tree use in winter. We are going to do some more of that actually out on the coast. But we've been looking a lot at mines, policy practice and monitoring for mines, how do bats use mines. We do have quite a few mines over in the West Kootenay that are used by a lot of bats and a lot of different species. We have a program we've called Batcaver. Batcaver.org is the website. That's been going for a number of years now, where cavers have been helping us put bat detectors underground and looking for then a critical habitat for species at risk, and just generally understanding bats and their use of caves. So far, we've definitely found more bats in mines than we have caves. This is actually just a QR code for something we recently produced with a project that's also kind of wrapping up a little bit right now. This is mitigating summer habitat loss, and we've got best management practices that we wrote up for the use of bat boxes in North America. And so this is a project that we were asked to undertake by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we worked cooperatively with the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative as well. So that QR code there actually would take you to the place where this document is housed on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service site. It's a very large document. We hope to put out a smaller version of it this winter, but with some guidance as to how bat boxes really should be used, because there have been some issues associated with them over the previous decades. I mentioned some fake bark. We've been working on basically trying to, as a stopgap measure, if we go into areas where the trees were cut down, and it's going to be a long time before there is bat roosts available again, then we have been working on how to mitigate for that. Knowing, there's a sea of green out there, but a lot of the trees are just actually not suitable for many of our species to raise young. And we do have at least 10 species that use trees to raise young in this province. Bat boxes versus building roosts and bat condos. And the last project then that's been going for a while, and it's still ongoing in the Vancouver area, one that you guys may be more familiar with. This is a trans-border project with Washington Fish and Wildlife, and we are looking at how to not treat white nose syndrome per se, but prevent it. It is a probiotic that we spray into the roosts, and then that prevents or at least slows the growth of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. So those are the projects we're doing right now. If you're more interested in any of those, maybe there's time later to talk, or you can certainly look at the website or contact me later. Now, as was mentioned in the introduction, I did write a book in 2022. Well, it took me about 4 years actually, with my co-authors to produce The Bats of British Columbia. You can learn about 18 of the species. There's only like 40 or so in North America. So that's quite a few bat species that are in the book. Their ecology is there, and most importantly, their bat acoustics. Now, there's not a lot of sources out there that show you their echolocation calls, and that's what I was going to focus on today, is trying to understand echolocation, because it is something that we don't necessarily talk a lot about. These bats are flying around, they're echolocating at night, navigating and finding their food this way, and it's really critical for who they are. So why bats do what they do, why are they the way they are, is kind of the topic of today's talk. And I could have gone 3 different directions. We could have talked about summer roosting and raising young, and because why do bats roost where they are? Why do some like houses? Why do some like bat boxes? Why do some never go in those? What do they need out of trees? All of that really requires kind of this underpinning understanding of torpor and energetics and their physiology. And I do sometimes present on this, so maybe another time, or maybe for BC Nature in general, I'll end up covering some of these other topics. Because there's also a lot more we're learning about winter. It's still a big question mark for many species, but we are learning some very interesting things about how bats roost in winter, what their hibernation ecology is like, and surprisingly, just how extensive the use of trees are in BC, across southern BC, for wintering of some of these bats. And certainly does give us pause when we look at the fact that a lot of winter harvesting in this province happens in winter, to avoid the problem of nesting birds. But again, this requires the torpor and energetics and physiology background. So I'm not going to really go into those things today. What I am going to focus on then is kind of understanding why bats the way they are in terms of foraging. They eat insects. How do they do that at night? And why are they doing it the way they do? And why do they look the way they do because of this? So I'm going to focus in on echolocation and morphology. Okay, so beautiful forest. Imagine a bat in this forest, in one of the old trees. Bats typically need kind of these older trees to roost in, because those are the ones that have the loose bark and the crevices. And so all of a sudden it's dark and the bats emerge, and this is what they see. So now the question is, how do they do that? How are they flying amongst all of this? And of course, you can imagine as a human, that would be pretty much impossible for us to be navigating, let alone finding tiny little bits of food. So the way bats do it, and I'm sure this isn't new to you, they echolocate. And now this is a human clapping hands. There was actually, if you listened to on CBC this past weekend, there was actually an interesting story on how humans do echolocate, especially if they're blind. You can actually take a training course, and they make little clicking sounds with their tongues, similar to what bats would sound like, and they can tell how far away something is. Now, we are going to talk about this from a bat's perspective. So in general, we're talking about things like navigating through a forest and looking for insects. So if we've got a bat then in a forest situation, and they're going to produce sound, they're going to produce it out of either their mouth or their nose. Most species in British Columbia produce the sound out of their mouth. There is one particular species, and I'll try to point it out when we get to a picture of one, that it's a Townsend's big-eared bat, and it has a really funny looking little nose, and that's because it'll echolocate, produce the sounds out of its nose, and it does that because it can actually alter the sound a little bit to its advantage. So once it produces the sound, then of course it's listening for the echo, and to listen for that echo requires good hearing. And bats vary quite widely in what their ears look like, how big they are. There's a little tiny piece within their ear called a tragus, and all of these parts of the ears then are important and will determine how they forage and where they forage and what size of insects and so on. So I will be kind of getting into that a little bit more then. So they, of course, learned how far away the object is, and they do get a sense of what it looks like. In fact, the wavelengths of the sound that they produce are so small that some bats can tell a great deal of detail about the insect that they're looking at. So we've often said bats can detect, something as fine as a human hair, and that is true with their very top end frequencies, but not necessarily all bats. And that's why this is kind of interesting to dive into what are some of the differences about bats. So keeping that in mind, I want you to think about kind of a couple of questions too that we're going to circle back to at the end, and hopefully I'll keep an eye on the time and make sure that we don't go over, because I would like to come back to this question because it relates to what you're going to learn today, and that is, have you heard that bats eat mosquitoes? And hopefully you're all like, yeah, but have you heard that they don't eat mosquitoes, because that is also out there. And so what is the correct answer? And so we're going to come back to that one at the end once we've gone through the material. And one other question then to keep in mind, and this is something that's quite relevant today because of a recent study that was published, and I'll talk about that near the end as well. BC has a lot of species. We have at least 15. We actually might have 17. A couple haven't been confirmed with capture. But what if we didn't have all those species? We've got more species here than anywhere else in Canada. Why is it important to have that biodiversity? Would it be okay if we just had a few bats species, but just lots of them, for example? So things to think about. Okay, now I hate to be boring about this, but we do need to dive into just a tiny bit of physics about sound to really understand how bats work. So sound is a wave. And for those of you who do have a physics background, you're probably instantly going, sound doesn't look like that. That's more like a ripple on water. And you're correct. Sound actually looks like what's on the right-hand side, where it's really a pressure wave of air molecules banging into each other and transferring energy. And so it's more of a pressure front of a wave, versus the one that's on the left is that sort of ripple of water, and the one that we can draw, we typically think of as a wave. I just want to put that caveat out there that air truly, or sound truly in air, is doing what's on the right-hand side, which is called a longitudinal wave. But it's unbelievably hard to illustrate that. So coming back to how we're going to talk about sound today, we are just going to talk about it in terms of an actual wave that would look more like one that ripples on water. Now, let's suppose we have a little object. I haven't given you a size for this, but we've got an object, and now a wave is approaching that object. The wave went right around the object. And that's because that wavelength was too long. It went right around the object. It did not hit it and bounce back. And of course, that's fundamental for the way that bats have to echolocate. They need an echo or reflection of sound in order to locate the object in front of them. So this comes down to the word I just used on the last slide, which was wavelength. So wavelength doesn't really matter where on the wave you measure it. It's one point to another, crest to crest, trough to trough. But a short wavelength versus a long wavelength is an important distinction for what we're trying to talk about today and the differences among the bats. So the wavelength itself has to match the size of the object that it's trying to detect. So if a bat is trying to use its sound to detect something very small, it's going to need very short wavelength. And then as long as that wavelength matches the size of the object that is trying to be detected, a reflection comes back. The bats would be able to hear that sound being reflected back and be able to tell information about it. So in a bat's world, we're talking about insects, because all the bats in Canada eat insects. And so we know that there's a huge variety in insects too, some very, very large moths, for example, all the way down to small midges or gnats. So the wavelength is what's most important. It has to match, and it has to be short then for all bats, basically, because they are looking for quite small food in general. Insects are small, so the wavelengths must be short. Now, what I'm showing you here is really, it's just a very crude graph. Frequency of sound then is on the y-axis. And I'm showing you at the very top a species, a small bat. This is the Eumomyotis. And the Eumomyotis produces our highest frequency calls that we have for bats in Canada, actually. These frequencies can start up well above 100 and come down to about 50 kilohertz. That's sometimes they'll go a little bit lower, but that's really high frequency sounds that they produce. This one's a little brown, and they produce high frequencies too, but they'll produce as low as 35. So the Yuma produces frequencies down to 50. The little brown will produce frequencies down to 35. And then there's a bunch of other species of bats that will produce even lower frequencies. We've made this artificial cutoff at 20 kilohertz as to what we call ultrasound, because most human ears are basically capable of hearing up to 20 kilohertz. Not everybody does. In fact, if you're not a really young girl, you're probably not hearing to 20 kilohertz. So as we get older, we can't hear such high frequencies. And for some strange reason, males can't hear as high a frequency. So it's really young girls who would actually even be able to hear 20 kilohertz. We do have a couple of bats that go below 20 kilohertz, and I will be talking about those. Generally, our highest frequencies that we're talking about for our species are about 120 kilohertz. Hey, and if you want to just put this in perspective, human voice, when we're talking to each other, of course, there's variation, but generally 5 kilohertz is what human speech is at. So the unfortunate part about physics, and this is unfortunate for the bats, is that the higher the frequency, the smaller or shorter the wavelength, the more quickly it attenuates in air. Remember back to when I said that the wavelengths, when you actually talk about movement of sound through air, it actually is hitting air molecules and that transfer of energy. And that, if it's a very short wavelength, the energy just does not transfer very far before it attenuates or weakens. And if it was a longer wavelength, then it would travel much further. So bats, when they're producing lower frequencies, they will be able to see further out. In other words, be able to detect out further in front of them. So right there now, that should give you some sort of context in which to understand bats that are likely to fly pretty far and fast. If they're going to do that, they're probably going to be needing to use lower frequencies. So what we've got so far is bats will typically echolocate at these high frequencies that we cannot hear. And the reason for that is they need to find insects or food, which is small. And so they have to use these high frequencies. Oh, okay, something's a little off there. Is there a way that we can hear the ultrasound? And what does it look like? So these are a bunch of bat detectors, essentially. And these bat detectors, they all do slightly different things. They allow you to see or hear the bat differently. And some don't allow you to see the bat, but just hear them and so on. These bat detectors is what we can use to hear these high frequency signals that we otherwise would not be able to hear because they're beyond our hearing range. So I'd like to just take a bat detector. So I've got one in my hand here, and I'll lift it up in a second. But I've always said to everybody that I'm really happy I do not hear ultrasound, because I'm breathing, but when I do it in front of a bat detector, wow. So I don't know if you've done that before. It's kind of fun, but also very annoying. So it's a good thing we don't hear ultrasound. But bats are hearing and producing ultrasound all the time. And yet they also are hearing audible and producing audible sounds as well. So some of you will hear bats squeaking in your attic. If you have some bats there, for example, they will be sometimes chattering to each other. And so they do all of the same things that we do, producing low frequency sounds. But the minute they kick into flying, they will echolocate, and especially then if it's dark, and using these higher frequency sounds. So what does it look like to see a bat echolocation pulses? So if you've not seen these, if you've seen a bat detector, you've probably seen these and recorded them onto an SD card or something, and then viewed them in a software package that allows you to see acoustic signals. So what you're seeing here is a sweep of frequencies. So this is a bat pulse, and it's starting in around 50 kilohertz and sweeping down to about 36 or so. And then there's a bunch of silence, and then another sweep of frequencies. So this bat is making a chirping sound, and we'll listen to bats in a second, and then nothing, and then another chirp, and then nothing, and another chirp and nothing. So that's what this looks like when a bat is flying around at night. The question is, then why is there nothing in between? And I realize that, look, when I'm there in person, and I'm so sorry I couldn't come in person, I would have loved to. But when I'm there in person, this is much easier to kind of get it interactive with the audience. So we probably won't be able to do that in this case. But I will just kind of give you a second to think about that. What's happening when the bat is not making sound? And maybe you're thinking, well, it's listening, and it is listening. Okay, so basically the bat produces the sound, and then it has to stop making that noise so that I can just listen for that reflection. And that's what that time is between the pulses. There's a little bit more to it, and I will get to that in a few slides. So coming back to the summary, then we know it's finding food, and we know that it is using these sound bursts and then waiting in between the sound bursts to listen for the echoes. Now, why are bats so darn loud? I didn't tell you they were loud, but they are definitely loud. And yes, big browns, this is a big brown bat here, they tend to echolocate very loudly. So there's certain species that really belt their echolocation calls out. On average, bats are just very loud. In fact, I've always kind of said to my assistants, like, make sure you don't put that bat in your ear, because if you do get the bat close to your ear, it can actually produce frequencies, sound decibels that can harm your ears. So not that any of us put a bat ever that close, but they're very loud. And you think, well, if they're really loud, then how is it that they're doing this? Like, don't they sound loud to themselves? And yes, they do, but they don't have earplugs. So what happens when a bat is echolocating, and they are, we're talking about the same decibel level as like a jet engine. It's basically the same as taking a smoke alarm that is going off and holding it up to your ear. So that's damaging. And obviously it would damage our ears. Bats are mammals, it would damage their ears as well. But luckily they have evolved a safety mechanism. So they have these specialized, or actually they're not all that different, tell you the truth. They just have more control over what's happening to the little bones in their ears. So the middle ear bones, they do have this ability to pull apart slightly, and that means that the sound doesn't conduct. And so this is what the bats are doing. They are disconnecting their little middle ear bones just ever so briefly to dampen that sound, and then they put them back together. So they will pull them apart while they're screaming, put them back together to listen for the echoes. And they're doing that 10 times a second. So it's really quite a physiological feat to be able to do that. So now we know the bats are so darn loud, and we know they're doing this because they need to see a long ways away. So this is the issue that bats face. They've got this physiological problem of having to produce really loud sounds because the wavelengths are so small on ultrasound that they wouldn't travel very far. So they really have to scream with every pulse. They scream and scream and scream. And luckily then they don't damage their hearing because they can disconnect those little ear bones to be able to do that. Okay, so coming back to this a little bit then. So in this interim period here between the pulses, they are listening for echoes, they're re-engaging their ear bones. Okay, and we have yet one more issue to deal with. And that is, if you think about screaming 10 times a second for the entire day, I mean, you would be exhausted, right? And bats are the same way. If they're screaming 10 times a second throughout the night as they're navigating around, they are spending a lot of energy. In fact, the amount of energy it takes to fly is the same amount of energy it takes to echolocate. And that's too much energy to have that happen every single night. So bats have evolved a way to save energy and synchronize these two things. So when you think about, let's say like you're doing push-ups for a human, you know, if we're going to be exerting energy, okay, or even for jogging, okay, we are going to be exhaling on the basically on the exertion. So bats do the same thing when they are flapping their wings. Then they're already exerting, and they're blowing out. They're blowing air out. Well, at that point, use that air to scream. So and so we actually have what we call the wing beat echolocation synchronization, and that saves them a ton of energy to be able to just echolocate on the downbeat. So when we go back to, and I don't think I have another slide on this, so I'll just run back to this for a second. So when we think about what the bats are doing here, they're producing a pulse, and they're listening, and they're producing another pulse. But what is also happening is they're flapping. So by looking at the amount of time between the pulses that they're producing, echolocation pulses, you actually are looking at the wing beat frequency as well. This is the amount of time it takes them to flap their wings. So again, small bat then will probably have a lot less time between pulses because they flap more quickly or more often than a large bat. So just even looking at echolocation calls of a species, even if I don't know what the bat looks like, and this is actually something I did in Mongolia one time. I was there to figure out what bats they had in the Gobi strictly protected area. And I didn't know what they were, but I put out some detectors and started figuring out what I was looking for. So then I started capturing bats and then piecing them together with their echolocation calls, because I could just tell, like, if I saw a bat that was producing very, very quick pulses, then I was looking for a bat with small wings, probably small wing beats, versus a large bat then that would have more time between the pulses. And I could also then tie that to the frequencies that they're producing, because smaller bats, this is where we're going next, smaller bats will produce higher frequencies, and the larger bats will typically produce the lower frequencies, and we'll talk about why that is. So we're done that. Okay, so what I wanted to do right now is just spend just a few minute or so, and I'm hoping this will work. It's the first time I've tried this on here. I'm going to play you basically it's a bat recording that I'm showing you in some software so that you can hear it. So first of all, we're listening it on what's called heterodyne. Okay, and heterodyne is oh, actually this, yes, listen right here. Okay, that was a little bit hard to hear, but we'll hear it on the next one. There is a little spot in
Did
here.
anybody hear anything?
Oh, can you
We
hear it?
heard nothing here, Cori.
Oh, shoot. Hmm.
Unless we're all old, and maybe our
No,
hearing doesn't hear that high.
no. Darn, it's too bad because, yeah, I can hear it here. Hmm.
I
No,
don't know
still
what we
nothing?
can do at this end.
Yeah, probably nothing then. Yeah, probably the only way, oh, this one's louder. Can you hear that?
Nothing,
A little bit?
not at all. Mm.
No. Okay. Well,
We can see the
the image,
wavelength picture, but that's all
Yeah.
we can
that's it.
see.
Okay.
I couldn't hear anything
Oh,
either.
no.
Okay,
Hmm.
Scott's at home, and the rest of us are in the learning center. So
Okay. Yeah, there might be some other setting. So Okay, well, I'll have to troubleshoot that later. So let me just summarize for you then. Basically, there's different ways of playing back back calls to hear them, and they just sound like little clicking sounds when you listen to them in real time, because they are producing these sounds so quickly. And in fact, what I was trying to point out here, there was a little spot where the calls got very, very close together. Basically, what will happen as a bat gets close to an insect, it can't just continue to echolocate on every wing beat. It needs information far more quickly than that if it's going to actually zero in on an insect. So it'll spend the extra energy and basically disconnect those things. It'll just flap as usual, but now it's going to be producing sounds much more quickly so that it can quickly belt out sound, listen for the echo, belt out, listen. And it'll do that as it gets closer and closer and closer to the insect. And it produces the pulses so quickly in a row that our ears can't even differentiate that there's pulses of sound anymore. It just puts them all together and it sounds a little bit like a zipping sound, or even like a little zip fart sound even. And we call that a feeding buzz. If you want to listen to all the rich frequencies that bats are producing, you would put them into what's showing on the screen right now, which is time expansion mode. And it slows everything down. Usually we do by a factor of 10. And so it sounds almost like a bird chirping. And that allows us to kind of piece out more about what the bat's actually doing. But in doing so, you take 10 times as long to listen as the bat actually took to produce the sounds. And we just need to do that for our human ears. One thing that I'll suggest, maybe if you want to listen, I have it queued up, but I won't bother on here because I don't know if you'd hear it. But if you Google singing silver-haired bats, okay, singing silver-hairs, you can put my name in there if you want. But I think it will show up even without that. And there's a little video that I put up there of YouTube of some silver-haired bats in the winter that I recorded flying around in the West Kootenay, just outside some trees and a mine where some of them hibernate. And they're mating. We know that because we've captured some and been able to tell that they had just recently mated. So this is, middle of the winter, and they're producing these really cool songs, and they sound really neat. So if you want to hear that on your own, then you can go to YouTube and just Google singing silverhairs and play that, and you'll see something very similar to this, except far more interesting patterns, because they're not actually echolocating per se, they're actually singing, and we think probably to attract mates. Okay, just to bring everything together now then, we've got echolocation, body shape, and insect prey type. And this is kind of the last little point there is to really kind of understanding how all these fit together. And I've already given you a little bit of hints as to how these things piece together. Okay, so just really quickly, because I'm going to be talking about some of the different species as examples, I was just going to introduce you to some of them. So the first one I showed there was a pallid bat. They got very big ears. Spotted bat, also very big ears, beautiful bats. These two are found in the Okanagan. The spotted bats are also found along the Fraser River, and in fact, most recently, and I think I have a slide for this later, we did actually have one show up in Chilliwack, which was way outside their range, especially at that time, and I think that was in 2021. So they're a pretty cool bat. This one is the Townsend's big-eared bat, so also very big ears. These are all very important for eating and finding their prey. This is the one that I mentioned. It has a really funny-looking nose, and that's because the Townsend's big-eared bat echolocates by producing sound out of its nose, and it alters the sound a little bit. And by altering it, it actually expands the range of frequencies that it can use to understand the distance and the texture and so on of its prey. That's the Eumomyotis. I did point out that one earlier. It's our highest frequency producing bat in Canada. And this one's just a little plain guy, long-legged myotis. This one can be found sometimes in buildings, and it's got pretty short ears. And it's kind of unremarkable in a lot of ways, and it's more of a kind of a standard feeding style, catching insects on the wing while the insect is flying. It'll find the insect, it'll scoop it up in its wing or scoop it up in its tail membrane and eat it. But all these other bats actually have different ways of eating insects. And I will get into more about how these big-eared bats work. And also this one, this Eumomyotis, does what's called gleaning. And so I will get into what those mean. Okay, just a few other examples, mainly just to show you some pretty pictures of some of the other species that kind of fall in the middle in terms of foraging types. So this is a fringe myotis. They have sort of medium length ears, and then there's a little brown myotis. Okay, oh, that's just fringe again. Oh no, actually that's a long-eared myotis. And that's a northern myotis. This is the species that is dependent on old growth. Okay, and this is a little California myotis. This is our smallest species that we have in BC, although the western small-footed definitely rivals it. California myotis is a species that you will find flying around pretty much all year. Here on Quadra Island, I'm recording them throughout the winter over in a little patch of old growth here, and I know they're recorded throughout many areas of the Vancouver area, including Stanley Park, where they hibernate in trees as well. And this little guy, oh, maybe that's our long-eared. Yeah. Oh no, that's western smallfoot. Sorry. Yes. So western smallfoot. Now, technically, that is the smallest bat, but California myotis and western smallfooted are both very, very small. The western smallfooted is also fairly hardy and will come out of hibernation in the winter as well. Okay, and finally, big brown bat, silver-haired bat, hoary bat, and eastern red bat. Now, these latter three, the silver-haired, the hoary bat, and the eastern red bat, are all considered in North America to be our three migratory bat species that go between US and Canada. So for the winter, they would move south into the US. In the summer, they come back up into Canada, especially the females, and they have their young. Now, what's very unusual, though, about BC is that the silver-haired bat is a year-round resident here. It's the only place that we know of in North America, really, and especially in Canada, where they do seem to stay all year and they hibernate. We've been putting bans on in the West Kootenay. We've been putting bans on some of these bats in the winter at a mine and capturing them year-round. They're in all seasons, same bat. Because we know from the bans, and they will be overwintering in a combination of trees and rock crevices and some mines. They're quite picky as to what kind of mines they actually use. The eastern red is now found throughout British Columbia. Just over the last decade, it's really expanded its range. They're not very common, but they do seem to be widespread, and I know that there's been quite a few acoustic recordings now, even out on Vancouver Island, of this species. And the hoary bat is our largest bat, and it will migrate very long distances. Then it can go down into Mexico. These three bat species, the migratory tree bat species, are the three that are currently being considered by the federal government right now to list under SARA as endangered, because CWIC did assess them as endangered because of the high mortality rates that they've been experiencing with wind turbines. Now, hoary bats are, I focused in on those because they are the largest bat and it's the one that flies the furthest. So if you think about what we know about ultrasound and echolocation now, we should be able to piece this together, that big bats that are going to be fast. So they're going to be very powerful and they're moving south fast distances, or sorry, long distances and fast speeds. They need to be able to see really far out in front of them to be able to do that. And so big brown bats are going to, or sorry, hoary bats are going to be producing these really low frequencies. It's kind of, you can kind of think about like headlights on a vehicle. You really can't drive any faster than your headlights will let you see. And so that's how the hoary bats are. They will use extremely low frequencies that get down into that 15, 16 kilohertz, definitely into human hearing range. And you will hear this species, it sounds like a little bit of a clicking sound then if you have that frequency range in your hearing. So off the bats go, producing these really low frequencies, but Okay, so what frequency of sounds would be good, high or low? I answered that for you. High, sorry, low, low frequencies. And then, do you think that this bat would echolocate loudly or softly? And so again, this is harder because I'm not there in the room, but yes, they would be very loud. So they're going to be belting out very low frequency sounds in very high decibel levels. Okay, there are, of course, problems because great, produce low frequencies because they travel far and you can fly fast and you can go long distances. But the downfall is, what do you eat? So if you've got some hoary bats here and we pretend that we've got one echolocating and detecting this nice large moth, yum yum, but here's this other one, poof, doesn't know that that insect's there. Because remember then, these long wavelengths will go right around smaller objects. So it does mean the hoary bat is pretty much stuck eating large prey. If they're close enough and in the right conditions, they can eat some smaller insects for sure. And I won't get into kind of the harmonics and other things that are associated with echolocation, but for the most part, when they're flying around looking for food, using these low frequencies, they are looking by default for the larger insects. On the other end of the spectrum then is these slow, small, maneuverable bats. So you got these tiny little bats, really rapid wing beats. They're not doing these long distance migrations. Okay? They're not heading down to Mexico for the winter. They might not even be hardly going anywhere for the winter. They're probably, several of these species we think do actually stay fairly close all the time. They do a little bit of mating in the fall. There's a little bit of movement, especially with the males. But for the most part, then the insects disappear and they have to go hibernate. So these are the ones that we are going to see in our mines, our caves, our rock crevices, and even our trees. And they are going to be eating then different things because they're foraging in different areas and they have a very different morphology. So they don't need to see out very far in front of them. They're going to be moving around in through, for example, forests. And because they are trying to then see kind of what's right out in front of them all the time, they're going to be looking for prey, they're going to be avoiding branches. The calls that they're producing don't have to go very far. So they can be really short wavelengths, high frequencies, and that allows them then to detect much smaller insects as well. So these are the ones that are going to see the tiny little, even the chironomids and the midges. They also don't have to scream because everything is pretty close to them. And so these are bats that are going to be considered kind of the quieter ones, that their echolocation calls don't have to go as far. And that means then that they're going to be out looking for small bugs, which are everywhere. And the downfall then, as I mentioned, is that they're going to be hibernating for the winter, though they're not going to be flying very far. Okay, and I also mentioned this already, how bats catch insects. So they can catch them in their wings, they can catch them in their tail membranes. But what about the insects that aren't flying? Do those just remain uneaten by bats? And the answer is no. There are some bats that are able to, in fact, they specialize on getting insects off of surfaces that aren't just flying around. So they do this with very big ears. So this bat here is actually listening to the little scurry of insects on a branch or in a leaf. They're listening for the flutter of moth wings. They've got extremely sensitive hearing, and they're not just listening to their own echolocation, then they're listening for prey-generated sounds of insects moving around off vegetation. So when a bat has very big ears, that's the first clue that they do more than just echolocate for their food. They can actually listen to the prey-generated sounds. Big ears are the key then. So now when you look at a bat, you can tell about its foraging. Does it have to just get insects flying around in the air, or could it get them off of vegetation? And when they get them off of vegetation, we actually call that gleaning. Okay, so pallid bats are a really cool species that is in the Okanagan. They have very large thumbs, just like a vampire bat. And that's because, like vampires, they move around on the ground. So a pallid bat will be going along very low to the ground with his large ears, and they also have large eyes because in full moon, they'll look for their prey as well. They're looking for scurrying insects on the ground. They will eat scorpions. They're the only bat that will do that. And they'll eat very large beetles. Jerusalem beetles are their favorite. So they're flying along close to the ground. They hear a scurry of an insect. They plop down onto the ground, cover themselves and their prey with their wings. They grab the insect. They got very strong legs, also like vampire bats, and they jump off the ground and continue to fly, which is actually really hard for most other species of bats to do. So this is kind of cool because they are getting their insects then by listening for them on the ground. And that's a Jerusalem beetle, their favorite. I mentioned they'll eat scorpions. So there's a big problem for pallid bats, though, in a study, many studies now are sort of showing this, that in areas where it's very noisy, pallid bats have a hard time finding food because they're listening for very, very soft prey-generated sounds. And of course, with our increasing noise, especially in the Okanagan, we've got a lot of highway noise. They don't do so well in terms of finding food. Okay, and finally, the cool species, the other cool species I wanted to mention was this really interesting moth. And you're thinking, why are we talking about moths? I thought we're talking about bats. Well, we're talking about moths because there's something very cool about how they have co-evolved with bats. So you see this little bat echolocating towards this moth, where there's an arrow is a tympanum, or an ear, essentially, a membrane that allows this insect to hear. These are the tympanic moths that hear bat ultrasound. So they are designed to hear high frequency sounds. So in most cases, bats don't eat these insects because if the bat produces the ultrasound, the insect hears it and they stop and they drop. And by doing so, they live because the bat misses them. They literally drop straight out of the air. But the spotted bat is unusual. They specialize on eating these insects, on tympanic moths. And that's because they produce not ultrasound. They produce the lowest frequency sounds of any bat in Canada, and rivals in North America, the lowest frequency bat, by simply producing sounds that we hear. So if you're in the Okanagan, you hear above you, that's your spotted bat. They're very actually easy to hear when you cue in on them. And so what's really cool about having a frequency way down here, okay, remember 8 kilohertz, we would hear that very close to human speech. By doing so, the moth doesn't hear them because their tympanum is designed to pick up ultrasound. So this bat has evolved to specialize on these tympanic moths because they don't hear the spotted bats. Okay, and I just wanted to end with some local significant things then. So locally, I did mention that Chilliwack was a site that we did get a reporting of a spotted bat moving in October. So probably doing some sort of migration. We know that we do have some overwintering ones in Oregon. There's probably more, but we just, like I said, know so little about what our bats do in winter. And then maybe I'll skip these just for sake of time. We just had a couple of cute little quiz questions, but this one I did want to come to because we talked about this one at the very beginning. Have you heard then that bats eat mosquitoes? And have you heard that they don't eat mosquitoes? So if you've heard either one of these questions, or you've always wondered who's right, the answer, hopefully now you can see, is that they're both right, right? It depends on the species. And we've got some bats eat mosquitoes because they see them. They have the right frequencies of echolocation to detect those smaller insects, and other ones don't. Like hoary bats, the big bats aren't going to eat mosquitoes. The small Yuma bat, the highest frequency producing small bat that we have, definitely eats mosquitoes. And in fact, they specialize on being, well, we call them an aquatic bat, really, because they specialize on skimming above water bodies and feeding on aquatic insects. And so those ones are definitely eating the most mosquitoes. So yes, our answer then depends on the species. Oh, and I won't go through this because this is just a little quiz as well. And let's just jump to the last question then. BC has more than 15 species of bats. If we lose some of this diversity, does it matter? For those of you who weren't aware of a published study in the prestigious journal Science back in September, this is a really interesting study that was done that shows how important it is to have our species of bats. And I believe I have, yes, here we go. This was an article done by, or published study, I should say, by Frank in 2024, and it's really quite astonishing. He looked for the last more than a decade now at data out of the eastern US where white nose syndrome has killed off a number of species of bats, and in some in very large amounts, nearly 100% mortality on some of these species in some counties in the eastern US. And he looked at those counties and could see that those counties had used over 30%, on average 30% more pesticides because of the loss of the bats and the loss of those natural pest control services. And in those same counties, then there was a significant increase in human baby mortalities. And so it sort of comes full circle. We've always known that bats are important for the ecosystem, for economy, and for human health. And now this study has finally brought all these together and pointed at, yes, the importance that we do keep our bats. And more importantly, by having more species of bats, you know, we've got probably more balance in the ecosystem because we've got a lot of variety of insects, a lot of different insects on our crops, on our gardens, in the forest. Like we definitely need more species of bats because we have more niches. We have, I guess, greater needs in terms of human health in the end. Because if we have to spray forests, we have to spray crops, we don't have as many organic options anymore. It ultimately ends up impacting human health downstream. So that's kind of an interesting new publication. And I think this is my last slide. I was just going to end on something that actually, here's all the text. I'm just going to end on this one. If you didn't know, Stanley Park is removing a lot of trees right now. And this was just brought to our attention not too long ago, this fall. They've already moved over 7,000. They're going to be removing about 20,000 in total. And they are doing it in the winter. I have recorded bats in Stanley Park for a couple of years in the winters, and the bats are hibernating in that park. And so we are a little bit worried about the tree removal. So we've kind of come to the Stanley Park Society, Ecology Society, and then the City of Vancouver is actually doing the removal. And at this point, we're asking them to, at minimum, take out just small diameter trees this winter, and hopefully the bats aren't really using those as much. And then to try to, in subsequent years, do the tree removal in times when birds aren't nesting. Of course, they're required to do that, and when bats aren't hibernating in those trees, which would be about mid-August to mid-October. So we're hoping for that next year, but as far as I've been told, the tree removal will continue this winter. I have not been able to confirm if they will try to skew it to small diameter trees that are less likely to have bats hibernating in them. Okay, so I went all over the board there, and there's tons more I could say. My husband's always joked that when he turns my bat switch on, it's very hard to turn it off, but I will turn it off because I am running out of time. And yeah, thank you for letting me go a full hour.
Well, that was wonderful, Cori. I'm sure there's some questions. So if anybody has questions, just raise your hand. I'm going to turn the lights on so I can see you if you ask. But if you have a question, oh my goodness, oh, somebody's going to get the lights for me. Any questions from in the audience here? Oh, yes, it's back there.
Give birth. Yes, if bats are mammals. Eggs, or do they give birth?
Oh, one of our members at the back is asking about the life cycle of bats in terms of birthing. So are they mammals and they're young or born alive? Could you give us a little bit of information on their when the pups are born, etc.?
Yeah, for sure. So yes, bats are mammals. They're long-lived mammals. They can live, depending on the species, up to 40 years, maybe probably more. We've had one over in Alberta that was banded as an adult and resighted 39 years later. So these are long-lived mammals. They only produce one young per year. And there's a 50% chance on average that that pup doesn't make it because they have to grow to full adult size in the summer, put on weight to hibernate, and that's a big chore that they don't always survive. So they are typically mating in the fall. They store sperm for the winter. And I have actually found now several species that are also mating again in the spring. But for the most part, they store the sperm, and then in the spring, the female will ovulate, and the sperm that is still survived for the winter, then whatever is there will have sperm competition to some form, and then fertilize the egg. Now the pup is born sometime later, and we can never say exactly what the gestation of a bat is. We say roughly 6 to 8 weeks, but it really varies. If the spring is very cold and there's not a lot of food around, the female will be in torpor. So that means she'll keep her body very, very cold, and very little growth will happen of that fetus. But if it's a very warm spring and there's a lot of food around, then she will be warm and her fetus will develop very quickly. So she could have the pup much sooner. Those are the ones that have a good chance of surviving the winter because they'll be born earlier. So yeah, and they nurse for about 3 weeks before they wean their pups, or their pup, I should say.
Another question here. Yes, Dennis.
Yeah, I was wondering about the spotted bat that was found in Chilliwack, and how was it detected, and how reliable are the audio detectors out there? Are there big variation? What?
Okay, so that's Dennis Knopf asking about the spotted bat found in Chilliwack, how it was detected, and how good those detectors are. And was there another part to that, Dennis? Is that good? Yeah, that's basically his question. You're like, how did you detect it?
Okay, yeah. So first, let me say that so the bat detectors that record their echolocation calls, because echolocation is functional, it is to find insects. And so if similar sized bats are looking for similar sized insects, they're going to have similar echolocation calls, even though they're completely different species. So a big brown and a silver-haired bat, extremely hard to tell apart acoustically because they're similar sized bats. They're eating similar insect sizes. And so I would say at that point that the recordings are not very reliable. And that's the case for some of the species where you can only do so good at trying to record them. You can try to record them out in the open where they're not reacting to any clutter. So they're just not getting any echoes. And that helps you tell them apart. But so there's tricks to the trade to be able to tell them apart, but it is not straightforward. But when we're talking about the spotted bat, so spotted bats are very easy to tell because you don't even need to record them. You can just hear them with your naked ear, a series of clicks. But in Chilliwack, it was the actual bat. So this bat was found, the landowner, I believe, is the one who reported it. It was on the second floor of an apartment building, roosting on a patio, like kind of on the railing of a patio, or somewhere in the patio. And we think it was just probably kind of forced to land because of a storm. And then it just spent the day there. So the local animal shelter rehab facility actually went and got the bat and kept it for, I think, maybe about 10 days, as I recall, fed it, and then drove it a ways away and released it. So it was a happy ending. But that was really interesting because Chilliwack was not in the range of spotted bats, but we think they're traveling down the Fraser River to migrate for the winter.
Interesting. All right, Lee.
How many different species can be in a maternity nest in a house?
How many species can be in a maternity nest in a house?
Okay, so in British Columbia, a house, I mean, that represents a lot of good roosting habitat with different microclimates and typically a lot of rooms. So there can be more than one species. Typically, little brown and Eumomyotis, for whatever reason, we don't understand why, but they will often use the same roost. Now they don't cuddle, they don't intermingle and cuddle with each other, but they will use the same roost. So sometimes it'll be little brown sort of in one end of an attic and Eumomyotis in the other. So they'll keep separate. In a bat box, sometimes it'll be Eumomyotis in one chamber and little brown in another chamber. There are basically two other species that you can find in buildings as well. The long-legged myotis will sometimes be in buildings, and then the big brown is actually a little more common to find in buildings. And they're a fairly good size bat, black wings, kind of a light colored body. And then if you're lucky enough, you might have some Townsend's big-eared bats, but you would know if you've got Townsend's big-eared bats in your building because they're the ones with just the giant ears. Ears is basically as long as their body length is as well. So they're kind of a prize to find in your buildings, but they're pretty picky. They don't like hot attics for the most part, for example. So not many buildings are suitable for that species.
What was that last one you said with the great big ears?
So Townsend's big-eared bat.
Oh, the
Yeah,
Townsend's
it's the one
big-eared.
with that funny nose.
Yeah,
Yeah,
oh, right.
echolocate out their nose. Yeah.
How about long-eared bats? Do they use houses?
Okay, yes. So long-eared bats will. It's not very common, and they're typically in very small groups. So like a Eumomyotis and little browns, they can be hundreds. Eumomyotis, there can be thousands of bats in an attic. Big browns usually about 30 to 50. A really big colony would be 100. But long-eared bats, they're more like 6, 12, and very small numbers. And not all that common either, but I have seen some roosting in like the nature house in Goldstream Provincial Park. I remember seeing a few in there. So they are around, yeah, and they will go into some buildings, often into sheds, but small numbers.
I have another question. Yes?
Different species can.
The question from the back, do the different species get along?
Get
So
along?
get
Oh,
along, cooperate. Do you mean cooperate or do you mean just don't fight with each other? Yeah, how do they interact?
How do they interact? Yeah. Well, that's interesting because we don't know a lot about that, but everything that I've seen in my career, I mean, kind of more than 20 years now of watching little browns in action, and they're an aggressive little species. And so I think in terms of interactions, probably the little browns are somewhat competitive, I think. And this is also a reason that we kind of suggest like to not put up bat boxes. There's many reasons to not put up bat boxes in natural areas to keep them urban. But one of them is because if you create an area where a bunch of little browns can come together, it might actually change the bat community or displace some of the other species. But the hoary bat, the largest species, the one that migrates south and into Mexico.
Oh, there you are, you're back.
Oh,
we lost the link for a minute. You just sort of froze, but there you are. Go ahead.
Okay. Did you hear me talk about, what was the last thing you heard me talk about? Hoary bat?
You know about putting bat boxes only in urban areas and not putting them in other areas.
Okay, yeah, because the little browns that are typical to use these bat boxes will be potentially displacing other species of bats, and that's more likely to happen in a natural area. So bat boxes are best kind of in urban areas where little browns are already probably using buildings. And then I was just skipping over to the hoary bat. The hoary bat is considered in some cases to probably be an aggressive bat. This is based on some evidence that shows that hoary bats will come in. Like I've actually played what we call distress calls from little browns. While you're handling a little brown, they'll make squeaky sounds and we will play those back. And hoary bats come into that. There are some published records of hoary bats eating other bats if they've been accidentally put in the same capture bag together. So that's a no-no, never mix species, especially the hoary bat.
Yeah.
And yeah, the hoary bat can be it can go into what we call stealth mode when there's other bats around. They'll actually turn off their echolocation calls, and it's really kind of hard to fathom how all this works. And this is quite a new discovery, but they also feel like that might be some sort of predatory action as well. So lots still to learn on the hoary bat, and they're the biggest one, and probably somewhat aggressive to other species.
Very interesting. Any more questions? Well, then at that, I'll say thank you very much, Cori. I learned a lot tonight. I think other people did. I had no idea you had been talking for almost over 45 minutes, and that I could listen for another hour, but I'm sure you have other things to do. So I say let's give her a round of applause.
All right. Well, yes, thank you so much for inviting me, and sorry I couldn't be there in person. Maybe next time.
Well, thank goodness that the weather cooperated and it didn't blow all your power out. We're
Yeah.
talking about terrible winds, et cetera, et
Oh.
cetera.
Terrible wind. We just got in on the ferries this afternoon, so that was, yeah, it all worked out. I'm very glad.
So thank you very much. And with that, we're going to just stop our recording if I can find it. Oh, yeah. Oh, Scott. Scott, do you have, let's unmute Scott.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Scott. Go
Okay.
ahead.
You were going to talk to me about something.
We asked if you had a question
Uh,
of our speaker.
well, yeah, I do. Just if there's time.
Yes, there is, I think.
You were talking about probiotics
Yeah.
in relationship to the white nose syndrome. And I was just wondering how that works.
Mm-hmm. So what we did was we took and wing swabbed hundreds of bats in BC, across British Columbia. We used 13 different species of bats. And then we worked with Thompson Rivers University and McMaster University. And they cultured bacteria off the wings of these bats. And they had over 1,200 different candidates of bacteria, and they challenged them with PD, which is the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. So when they challenged it, they could see which bacteria would inhibit the fungus that causes the disease. And then they took those ones and started doing them in combinations to see which ones work together well. So we ended up with 4 bacteria that were naturally found on bats' wings, and we've created what we're calling our cocktail. And it's literally these 4 bacteria that we culture, we freeze dry, and then we spray onto the roosts. So spray up into the bat boxes or spray onto the rafters in a building, for example. The bats then, when they're roosting during the summer, are picking these bacteria up in their wings. Now, some of them already have natural occurrences of these, but only some. And so we're kind of calling this like the Robin Hood approach, right? So that all the bats are getting these microbes. And then they go off into hibernation. And in theory, the fungus then doesn't grow as well on their wings or at all throughout the winter. Now, to test that, what we've done, we did take some bats, some captive bats, and we did put them into hibernation in a chamber and looked at what happened with the probiotic. So they had small amounts of these bacteria on their wings that we had transferred to them through their roost, and the bacteria grew really well in the hibernation conditions. What we didn't do was infect those bats with PD, because that's a whole other layer of permitting, for one thing, but also keeping bats long term to see that fungus grow in their wings. Unfortunately, what a lot of the labs have found is that all the bats end up dying. It's just hard to keep these bats in captivity in the winter. And so they were asking questions like, well, the bats that we treated, did they die later than the other ones? And so for many reasons, we didn't challenge them in that way. We are doing a natural experiment, because now, by working with Washington, we're putting probiotic on the bats in some natural roosts. They have 6 study sites in Washington. We have 5 in the Vancouver area. And we just now finally this year seen the fungus and the disease in all of the sites. So as of next year, we're going for 2 more years, and we hope then to see the effect of our probiotic, if it reduces the mortality rates on the treatment roosts compared to the control roosts that don't get the probiotic. So far, what we've seen is promising, because the lab just gave us results a few weeks ago. Then they've plotted that if bats have this probiotic on their wings that they've picked up from the roosts, they don't have the fungus, or if they do, it's very small amounts. Compared to the bats that don't have the probiotic, those are the ones that have the high loads of the fungus. So fingers crossed, it looks like it's working, but
Yeah.
we won't know all full results for a couple more years.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So are you saying white nose syndrome is now found in British Columbia in the Vancouver area?
No, the fungus is found only in the Grand Forks area still. You know, to be completely honest with you, though, the government hasn't submitted their samples. Like the samples are still sitting in a freezer. They weren't even sure they were going to get funding to process them this year. And I kind of been talking to the media a little bit about that, trying to like get it higher elevation that they can actually process these samples, because we don't know. Like from last winter, we don't know if the fungus has moved into the area or not, because the samples haven't been processed. We did our own sampling in our study sites and we didn't find it though. So we don't, at this point, we don't think it's in the Vancouver area still. Yeah, but it's definitely in Washington. But we've been putting probiotic on our bats since 2019. That's how long we've been doing this testing. And we're finding the probiotic even in our control sites now. We think the bats are just mingling. They're mingling and they're spreading it to each other. So if it is working, you know, we might never get the disease. And I know that's good for bats. It's just really bad for our experiment to be able to say that it's working. So yeah. Anyways,
Okay.
I will let you on to your meeting, and thank you again. So
Yeah,
I'll
thank you very, very much.
here. So okay. Thanks so much. Bye.
Yeah.